Hey, this is Torrin Walker. If you like Context Media Group, help us to keep telling stories. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Wednesday Wisdom. This is Torrin Walker, and I have a very special guest with me today. She is the representative for the 84th District of Georgia. Please welcome Representative Renitta Shannon. Representative, how are you doing today?
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for appearing. I really appreciate you showing up. I just want to get right into it. This has been a chaotic 2020. It's been a chaotic electoral year. We're finally at the end of it. We're moving into a new year, but some difficult challenges for legislators. Atlanta has been a very integral part of what we've seen over this electoral process. And what would you say would be Atlanta's legacy for the 2020 election, going back to Atlanta's legacy as an electoral city and as a majority Black city that's been very strong with representational politics?
Well, first, I would say it's not just Atlanta. It's Fulton County, DeKalb County, and most recently Gwinnett County. So it's important to realize that it is the entire metro area that is really making this moment happen. And I would say that, specifically when you think about Atlanta, Atlanta has always been a center of really pressing for justice on the issues that we care about the most. And so I think that the recent elections are finally the culmination of largely Black and brown communities being able to stand up and decide in a very significant way the direction of the country and the direction of the state of Georgia.
Do you think we're seeing a shift in the way that national politics is looking at the South? Because there's a traditional attitude towards looking at Southern politics like you either have to use the Republican Southern strategy of basically appealing to conservative and right-wing voters and not really even paying attention to Black and brown voters. Do you think what we've seen over the past few months and the focus on Georgia has maybe shifted that attitude towards electoral politics?
Well, I think that the GOP is still using the Southern strategy. That's all they have. And they have really, created a base that pretty much only focuses on what is good for white men. So that's just their electoral strategy. So they're still using that. I think what you're seeing on the Democrat or the progressive side is that we are continuing to build a multicultural coalition to be able to put those votes together to move forward with what we need. Now, what we do need to see is that the Democratic Party does need to understand and really put some, I would say, effort behind the realization that it is really Black voters, particularly Black women, that are able to create these electoral wins that we are seeing. So it's really important that the Democratic Party needs to really focus on the issues that people of color and specifically Black people do care about. So I do think that that's what you're seeing.
Do you think there's been a little bit of neglect in that area? Do you think it's been deliberate, or do you think they just don't know how to approach that and they feel like using some of the strategies that'll work from the 80s up until now will work?
Oh no, it's definitely been, there's definitely been a deficit. I would say that racism and anti-Blackness is bipartisan. And so there has not been I think because of the level of anti-Blackness in this country, there's been a resistance to focus on Black issues. There's been a resistance to focusing on anything other than issues that are traditionally lifted up by white communities. And so that's why I stress that it's very important that the Democratic Party understand that voters are not, particularly Black and brown voters, they're not going to continue to show up and show out like we did in the last two previous elections with the presidential race and the U.S. Senate race if you do not prioritize fixing our issues. That's just the bottom line. And that's really true for any group. It's one of the reasons why you've seen Republicans be able to mobilize voters that they never had before. Why? Because they started putting forth policies that a base of folks were not typically being engaged. That's all Trump did. He came out and he put forth through his campaigning and his actual administration policies for people that previously had not been engaged. And he continued to do that, which is why 75 million people came out and tried to reelect him. The Democrats need to take note of that. You cannot continue to ask people to show up and vote and put you in leadership if you are not going to directly work on the issues that the issues that are important to them. And it will be important for Democrats not to shy away from race. Realizing who your base is, realizing how your coalition is formed, it is important to directly address those issues.
Why do you think there's been such a reluctance to address these issues, especially from the people who the Democratic establishment, the DNC, never tires of saying that this is your base? Why not address that directly? What's the fear there?
I think, again, it is a symptom of the level of anti-Blackness in this country. Anytime that, if you remember when President Obama was elected, there were a lot of folks who were saying things like, oh, well, he's going to be the president for only Black people. So there is a lot of anti-Blackness that still exists. Nobody ever really says anything when policies are centered in what is good for white people. Nobody really says anything about that. But when you try to address policies and move forward with policies that are specifically good for Black people, that is when you do sort of see a pull away from that, or people shy away from doing that. And it's not right. I mean, it is the racism of policy and electoral politics.
Do you think there's some hesitation from people who are in the establishment, Democrats, like some Black people and some Black representatives that have been here for a while, to address these issues?
I think that they, are, some folks, they are hesitant to stand up for the policies that they know that we need because of the pushback that they may receive. I have in times where, so for example, in my role, I come at this with a very intersectional lens, and I do reach for policies that make sure to close the gap in race and gender, sexuality, many different things. There is a tendency for some representatives to not really look to do that because they may get pushback. And so I have even faced pushback sometimes when I am saying on a particular policy, the old way that we've done things is not sufficient to lift everyone up. We need to take into account that Black people are being disproportionately affected by a specific policy, and we need to lift policy up that will actually fill some of the deficits that Black people have faced under old policy. And I have received pushback from folks who will say, well, why are you prioritizing the needs of Black people over everybody else? Well, when you look at the disproportionate harm that has come over decades to Black people in this one specific area, why would you not? It's akin to the fire department showing up in a neighborhood and spraying water on all the houses. Not all the houses need to be sprayed with water. Some houses are on fire and others are not. Put the water where the fire is. So.
All right. Something else we've seen in this electoral season is the contrast between inside power and outside power, where people who are on the streets and conducting street protests and holding space on the street are pushing back against some people who are inside of state legislatures. We've also seen a lot of conversations happening where people who were protesters are starting to move into electoral politics and becoming legislators and that sort of thing. But there's still a need for people from the outside to talk to the inside. Where do you see any kind of struggle within that, or do you think that's a good thing for these conversations to be happening?
I think it's a good thing. I myself came from community organizing in my personal time before deciding to run for office. So it wasn't my 9 to 5, but it was something I was doing in my personal time. And it is the being involved of speaking truth to power on the outside that led me to decide to run for office. So I think it's a good thing, particularly because a lot of the people who are elected are not people who came from a background of community organizing. So they may not, community organizers have a couple of things that really, and I don't want to just say just when I say community organizers, I mean activists, I mean the outside, like what you're talking about. Those are the people who are on the ground facing the effects of issues every single day. And a lot of times, these people are more informed about policy than some people who run for office. So it's definitely important that those conversations continue. And it's important that elected officials don't rebuke those conversations, because your policy becomes a lot better, and you can get a lot more progress if you actually are willing to have conversations with people who work on specific issues every day, all day. Whereas as a legislator, we have to we have to work on many, many different issues. So it becomes hard to spend all of our time just on one issue. So I think those conversations can be very, very valuable.
All right. One more thing that we've seen that kind of ties into the last question. This electoral cycle has seen many Black progressives go into elected office. Cori Bush in Missouri, Jamal Bowman, others. What do you think that the effect of Black progressives moving into national politics is going to have on the conversations that are taking place in the Democratic Party?
Well, so I would say, yes, I'm very excited about those elections. I would say the same thing is happening at the state level. There are folks like myself who came from community organizing and who have brought that same spirit into state level politics. So I know what the effect will be because it's been similar to what has happened here in Georgia. When folks like myself and Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman and others come in and they know their issues and they've come directly from the community, they have the effect of pushing the Democratic caucus to further to the left. They have the effect of questioning policy that previously would have just been passed through with bipartisan support. That's what we've seen here in Georgia. I remember my first year in the legislature, a lot of folks, I would say, would not think twice about going along with GOP, going along with Republican policy. They may not like it, but they were hesitant to vote no because they felt like they didn't have the numbers and they didn't feel that they could effectively fight back. When you have folks get elected, like myself, who come in and say, no, we don't have to support these things, whether we have the numbers or not. And by the way, if we actually get a strategy together to be able to fight, that courage is contagious. That's what happens. And so as you get more and more of those folks elected who are willing to take on the fights and show others that we can win, it definitely has an effect. Because much of what I see that the Republicans do, a lot of it happens in the dark. When you engage, it's allowed to happen in the dark. When you engage the public and you really fight back against policies that are going to be particularly harmful to community, you definitely see that sometimes we're able to win some of these fights.
Another thing I want to touch on is this idea that's going around in national politics and in some state politics about the idea that we have to build coalitions with everybody, even against people who have committed active harm against Black and brown people and other people who have been marginalized. Do you think that the time is right for people on the left and people in the Democratic Party to say that this is what we stand for and we don't have to build coalitions with people who are actively harming us? Do you think there's some courage behind that right now?
I hope that that's what Democrats decide to do. We do not have to try to hold hands with people who are actively trying to oppress us. It doesn't work. And one of the things that really upsets me or that it continuously annoys me is that Democrats are always talking about bipartisanship, but Republicans never do. When they get in power, they steamroll their agenda. We need to be doing the same. And as I said before, it's true. It's more difficult on our side because we do actually have a coalition where if you look at we have a coalition to keep together. When you look at the way that the Republican Party is built, it's essentially all white men. If you look at the state house just here in Georgia, I think Republicans are at a number of 102 or 105. All of them are white men except about 10 white women in the Republican Party. So for them, their agenda is essentially what is good for white men because that is the majority of who represents their party. That is the majority of who votes for them. Not to say that Democrats don't get any votes from white men, but at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that we have a coalition to hold together and we should not be prioritizing making happy people that will never vote for us, do not vote for us, and in the future, will not vote for us. That doesn't make any sense. So I'm hopeful that Democrats will take this opportunity to get done what we need to get done for our party and for our communities that support us. Because as I said before, people are not going to continue to show up and vote if they feel like there is nothing on that ballot for them to vote for. And the respectability politics of telling people you just need to vote because you should be ashamed if you don't, and people have lived and died and fought for the right to vote. All of that is true. And I think many people will agree with you on that, but that doesn't actually, number one, force anyone to vote. And number two, that is not enough to propel someone to actually take the time to jump through all the hurdles, and there are many hurdles in Georgia, to jump through all the hurdles to actually be able to vote. It doesn't. You have got to give people something to vote for. Voting is about self-interest. And we are, I would say, if you look at any political party that has been able to continue to win elections, that is what they are doing. They are giving the people who support them something to vote for.
Do you think some of that goes back to some of the generational differences that are between people who've worked in the civil rights movement and have moved into electoral politics, who what worked for them, they feel like should work for them in the 21st century? And you think there's some pushback against that, or there's some hesitancy to deal with younger people and younger activists who want more than that?
I do think that there is a hesitancy. Yeah, I would agree that there is a hesitancy for some. And I do think also looking at term limits, the fact that we don't have any term limits here in Georgia. So you can definitely find representatives who have been elected for 20, 30, 40 years. It can be hard for folks it can be easy for representatives to sort of stick with what initially got them elected, but times do change. And so if they are not continuing to have conversations with the public, or if they are inflexible about hearing how times have changed, then that is an issue that it's going to be very difficult. And so I think that's why I think when you look at some of the recent success of Georgia going blue in the presidential election, and you look at what happened with the U.S. Senate seats, and Democrats being able to perform to bring those seats home, you had a lot of organizations who were finding ways to reach out and turn out voters in non-traditional ways. You had organizations like the New Georgia Project, Stand Up, Pro Georgia. They were finding ways to speak to voters in ways that they care about, not what you think they should care about.
All right. Speaking of the Georgia election, Georgia and the South, but especially Georgia and Atlanta, saw a full court press for the past few months to get John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock elected. I mean, there was an aggressive campaign. There were signs everywhere. There were nonstop radio ads and television ads, and there were people actually knocking on doors. Now that the election is decided, what can people do, and what can some of these organizations do to keep that momentum going to get actual legislation passed after the election is done?
Sure. So I'm glad you asked this question, because one of the things I always talk about, especially coming from a background of community organizing, is just that electing folks is the first step. Electing people who have your values, that's just the first step. You do have to hold elected officials accountable. So it is very, this is when the real work starts. It's important for people to be following up and checking the voting records and staying in contact with people that they have recently elected at all levels of government. So it's not just the two new U.S. senators that we have. It's who you've elected to the state house. It's who you've elected to the Senate. It's who you've elected to city council. It's who you've elected to be mayor. It's very important that everybody stay engaged and continue to follow up with these folks and push for what it is that you want to see. Because without the public, we don't have a job. I can't give myself this position of state representative. Only the voters can do that. So it's only right for voters to continue to say, okay, great, now I put my trust in you, I've elected you, this is what I would like to see.
State Representative Renitta Shannon, thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.